John Gast, a German immigrant, painted this in 1872. It is what we call a myth, a powerful story about the past that is really a story about the present and the future. It matches well with Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. In 1893, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner gave a celebrated lecture called The Significance of the Frontier in American History, in which he argued that on the western frontier the distinctive qualities of American culture were forged: individual freedom, political democracy, and economic mobility. Turner's was one of the most influential interpretations of American history ever developed. While Turner described a process that may have been true before the Civil War, the post-Civil War West he actually lived in, around 1893, did not look like his thesis. People entered from the east and the south. They didn't take free land. It was subsidized land through things like the Homestead Act. There was a key role of government in creating opportunities for corporations and for individuals, so it wasn't all individual initiative and individual freedom. So Turner offered only a partial account of Western history. Most settlers moved west in family groups or as members of immigrant communities, not as lone pioneers. Turner seemed to portray the West as an empty space before the coming of white settlers. Of course, it was already inhabited by Native Americans, whose dispossession was essential to the opening of land for settlement by others. Additionally, the West was hardly a uniform place of small, independent farmers. There was forced Indian labor in California. Landlords, railroads, and mining companies also utilized Mexican migrant and indentured laborers in the West, along with Chinese working on long-term contracts. After the Civil War, the West changed the United States in many ways. Confronting the Western territories forced the federal government to grow. It reshaped the U.S. military, and the scale and extent of public subsidy greatly favored private corporations. Most of all, it led to a new story about what it meant to be an American and who was American. So we've got two more Buffalo links. We're going to talk about buffalo and the ecological consequences of expansion. The destruction of the buffalo leaves an ecological vacuum in the Great Plains, and cattle step in to fill that vacuum. Cattle's success is no more purely natural than buffalo's disappearance. Both are closely tied to the growth of the American economy and expansion of the railroads to the west. The Texas Longhorn cattle were a very lean, fierce breed of cattle, which made them less than ideal for butchering. You would get about 9 pounds of hamburger in 900 pounds on the hoof. But they were very hardy. They could travel long distances for water. They had imposing horns, which allowed them to defend themselves against wolves. And while large numbers died in winter, they generally survived without a winter feeding. They were thus ideal animals for driving long distances over land. But Texas Longhorns carried a tick, which transmitted a disease called Texas fever. Longhorns could handle the disease from long exposure, but when animals were driven over land, they infected dairy cattle and wiped them out. Missouri banned Texas cattle drives in 1851 and again in 1861. So cattle towns had to be far west of populated areas. The railroad fit these needs perfectly. Abilene, Kansas in 1867 was the first of the cow towns. So the 1880s were the apex of the cattle boom. Europeans invested in western herds, and it was a cheap business. There were low wages to pay to the cowboys, calves were cheap, grass was free, and there were high returns for mature cattle. The cattle boom seriously overstocked the range, though. By the mid-1880s, there were about 7.5 million cattle on the Great Plains, and compare that to the buffalo numbers we talked about earlier. This was both economic overproduction and ecologically unstable. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Cold winters in 1885 and 1886 provided the immediate cause. From a third to half of the cattle died in each of those winters. Because of events like this, economic disasters worsened because cattlemen rushed to sell their surviving cattle in 1887 to make up for their losses. This pushed the price down further. This also leads to a rise of conservationist thinking. This disaster was neither an accident or bad luck. It would be repeated elsewhere with livestock in the arid Great Basin that lies between the Rockies and the Sierras and Cascades. These disasters illustrate a basic pattern in the West: overuse of natural resources that seem limitless but turn out to be quite fragile, wasteful, unregulated, and uncontrolled markets. And this pattern was found in grazing, as we have seen. It's found in mining, in fishing, in logging, with wildlife. And these guys make me really sad. These are the last passenger pigeons ever. And Martha was the last female who died in 1914. But the last male passenger pigeon didn't even have a name. He was a male pigeon, and he died. It's very sad. So, in other words, the things that we think of as Western, mountains, grasslands, forests, rivers, and wildlife, were literally consumed by a voracious American economy in the late 19th century. So the destruction of Western resources forces some in the government and in industry to call for greater governmental control over the Western lands. Eventually, this will bear fruit in two things. The U.S. government stops selling the land and decides to keep managing it forever. And the government takes a regulatory role in managing natural resources like forests, rivers, grasslands, and mountains. So it leads to a larger government. The government is forced to grow by the West. So buffalo are a way to look at how things are happening in the West and see that they are actually very connected with what's going on in the rest of the U.S. So I'm going to use buffalo one more time to finish our discussion of the West and link it a bit more to the rest of the country. So I'm going to talk about Buffalo Bill and the emergence of mass popular culture. Buffalo Bill is an example of how incredibly mixed up mythical representations of the West and the reality of the West were. So he gets his name from hunting buffalo before, he hunts them for the railroad. And Buffalo Bill was actually on the stage in Delaware when news was received that war had broken out with the Lakota. And what he did was he stepped to the edge of the stage and said that he had to leave to go west as a scout with the army. And he vows to take the first scalp in revenge for Custer. So as a scout, Buffalo Bill dresses in a Mexican vaqueros showman's costume. He wears this so that he can later say that this was the exact costume I was wearing when I took the scalp for Custer. Buffalo Bill kills Yellow Hand. He immediately quits the cavalry and tours the nation showing off the scalp and reenacting the battle. Buffalo Bill then organizes the Wild West show. He recruits the actual Indians that he had fought, like Sitting Bull, and brings them into the show to reenact battles that they had fought against whites. There are connections to immigrants here. Soldiers who fought with Custer were largely immigrants, and the people who came to watch his Wild West shows were also largely immigrants. Buffalo Bill is telling stories about the West here, just like John Gass' painting or Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis. Buffalo Bill's shows continued to mythologize and romanticize the West. So mass culture is emerging in the late 19th century, where stories can be dispersed very quickly and easily. People far from the West are made to feel part of the story. The West is claimed by all of them in that sense. Frederick Jackson Turner and Buffalo Bill are both telling stories about their times. Sometimes these stories even overlap or compete. That is the essence of historical interpretation. Figuring out which stories make the best sense of a time is our job. Many of these older tropes or storylines remain with us. There is a direct link between Buffalo Bill's stories and the Western movies, and between the Western movies and our present ideas about the West and about frontiers generally. So, we have talked about the South and the West after the Civil War. I have shown how the market, the economy, was transforming areas of the nation far from its population centers. What had once been distinct regions, even isolated hinterlands, now became integrated into American life through the market, through the railroad, and through an expanding government. These areas were also being connected by the movement of people. Immigrants from overseas and migrants from the older parts of the U.S. poured into the West and moved about in the South. This expansion had consequences for everyone, for the people already in the West, for the newcomers, and for the land itself. Next time, we will talk about the cities, about who was eating that Western beef, building with the wood from Western forests, and making steel with Western ore. So, before we meet this week, Make sure that not only have you watched these, you have done the readings, and you have taken the online attendance quiz. If you have any questions between now and then, please feel free to contact me. And I hope you enjoyed our discussion of the West, which we will discuss more in person with the documents this week.